Hi, I'm Robin-Yann Storm. I'm here to talk about there's no such thing as a sensible default. First of all, who am I? I'm Robin-Yann Storm. I used to work at indie studios on games for console and PC. I was then a co-founder of an indie studio for a very little while. I then did some freelancing and consulting as a tool designer. I was then a tool designer in the AAA industry, where I worked at IO Interactive on the Glacier editor, Glacier 2 specifically. I was then a tool designer in the AAA industry at Guerrilla Games, working on the Decima editor, which is used to, for example, build the Horizon games. And I was a tool designer at Apple for the last 3.5 years, and I've now quit that job to once again become a workflow consultant and freelance tool designer. One thing I think is important to mention is I'm in the Unreal Hall. There's a big logo behind me. I'm going to be slightly critical of Unreal here and there, so sorry in advance if anyone from Epic is here. All right, so there's no such thing as a sensible default. What does that mean? Well, this is about tool UX and UI. It's about the well-being of your users, and it's about the quality and speed of what you create. So let's take a look at some examples. This is Unity, and these are the sections of Unity, if you can quickly look at them. For example, the hierarchy, the toolbar, the 3D view, the property panel, and the asset browser. If you look at Unreal, it's very similar. Kind of the same sections. Asset browser now a little bit hidden in the bottom at first, and we can expand that. 3ds Max, similar. Hierarchy is now on the left again. It was on the left and the right, now it's the left again. There's no asset browser in this case that we can immediately look at here. Then there's Maya. Again, very similar stuff, same kind of sections. There's many more toolbars though. You can see a lot more yellow sections now. And of course, new kid on the block, the hotshot, Blender. Very similar kind of setup, lots more toolbars in this case, but sort of same kind of ish things that you see. Now what are those? Those are sensible defaults. It's basically what is shown by default, and are those defaults sensible? And the answer to the second question, of course, is no. They can never be sensible. It's impossible for them to be sensible because tools need to be editable and shaped to the user. Now, to some of you, this will be new, and I'll try to inform you about what this is. And to some of you, you're probably thinking, yes, I know that, but how do I convince everyone else that it's important? So I hope to cover both of you in this talk. And to do that, we first need to talk about The End of Average. It's a book by Todd Rose, released, I think, in 2016 or 2017. I highly recommend reading it. It's very good. But there's a particular story in there that I want to talk about here, which is that in the 1940s, the US Air Force had an issue. Pilots were having trouble. They were crashing, swerving, all kinds of issues. And of course, what was brought up as the issue, what was going wrong here? Pilot error, of course. User error. They must be doing something wrong. But if you have that many really good pilots doing something wrong, there might be something else going on. So maybe it's the planes? Nope, there's no mechanical or electronic failure either, so that can't be it. So what ended up being an issue? Well, they found out the design of the cockpit. How do you control the airplane? Because it turned out it was shaped and measured from people in 1926. It's a little while ago. People have changed, and it was averaged out for that particular shape. So what was the idea? Let's measure them again. So they measured them again, measured thousands of pilots. But then someone asked, wait a second, who fits the average? If we measure all these people and average it out, who fits into that cockpit? And the answer, of course, is nobody. Nobody will fit in that cockpit if we average them out. To give you an idea of what that looks like, let's grab all these different body parts and whether they're larger or smaller. And this is pilot one. He might have a smaller head, smaller shoulders, smaller chest, larger arms, smaller waist, larger legs, and sort of middling feet. All right, pilot two, larger head, larger shoulders, larger chest, smaller arms, larger waists, longer legs, and bigger feet. Now we can see, of course, from this, the average pilot is this one. That's, of course, now pilot one isn't comfortable, and pilot two also isn't comfortable. So the average pilot here, is just going to make these people comfortable. And you might say, well, this is a very nicely, perfectly mirrored graph. Of course, that's going to be difficult, but it doesn't matter how we calculate this. No matter what the measurements are, that average is not going to work out. One pilot's going to be uncomfortable, and the other pilot is going to be uncomfortable. So the thing that they learned was there's no such thing as an average pilot, and designing for the average means fit for nobody. So what was the actual solution? Make it adjustable. Adjust the seat for the leg length. Adjust the controls for the arm length. Let the people adjust to the cockpit. And they did that, and of course, the manufacturers of the planes complained a lot. They were like, this is expensive, difficult, we haven't done this before, but it's the US Army. They're going to go, no, do it, or we're just not going to buy planes from you. So, okay, they had to do it, and of course, they found really nice, easy ways to do it, and nowadays they use it as a marketing gimmick to say, like, hey, we can adjust stuff, so, of course. But anyway, they did it. Pilot performance soared. Everything went really, really well, because you let the cockpit adjust to the pilot, not the pilot adjust to the cockpit. So now the pilot setting can be set for pilot 1 or can be set for pilot 2. So there's no such thing as a sensible default. What we can see here is that no default can please everyone. Having the defaults be rigid is a problem, and letting your users decide what they need is really, really important. At this point, you're probably thinking, sure, but I'm not a pilot, I'm a game developer. Okay, there's the difference there. Okay, I get it. So what is the cockpit of a game developer? Well, let's think back to the human being. It's your physical space and your digital space. So let's start with the physical space. What do you adjust, for example, when you're sitting down in your cockpit? Your chair. How high is it? Where are the armrests? How far does the back go? How far is it from your desk? Is it soft or hard? Are you comfortable in it? Does it roll or not? Do you have rollers or not rollers? Now, of course, all these things came with a default when you first got that chair, but when you first sat down in it, you were like, okay, let me just, adjust this, set it up right so I'm comfortable in this position. You might have done it just once, but if you don't do it that just once, your back will hurt, your shoulders will hurt, you'll just get like RSI, you'll get all kinds of problems, you have to go to physio. So it's just once, but it was very important that you did that. What are other things? Well, your table, for example, same thing with how high is it, how big is it, what do you do with it? Your screen, how far away is it? How bright is it? Is it a high refresh rate or not? Did you turn it 90 degrees so you can read code easier? All kinds of just setup things. And your keyboard, does it have a numpad or not? Do you have one of those ergonomic keyboards that you have to hold like this? I can't do that. I'm not used to that. But a lot of people work really well with those. And your mouse, does it have buttons on the side or not? There's, again, so many things that you adjust in your physical space. So thinking back to the human being of what are you adjusting, it's your chair, your screen, your desk, your keyboard, your mouse. What's the binding concept here? It's you. You are unique. In fact, your job is probably unique because there's many factors involved depending on how your job goes. It's your studio, your company, your manager, your tools, your culture, your skills. Depending on all these things, your job will be different. For example, what kind of level designer are you? Level designer 1 might do a lot of, not a lot with geometry, not a lot with materials, a lot with narrative, not a lot with combat, a lot of 3D art. They love doing environmental narrative storytelling. They don't do a lot of lighting, and they don't do a lot of scripting. Well, level designer 2 might do a lot of geometry work, a lot of materials, not a lot of narrative. They don't care about that as much. Combat, they do a lot, though. It's necessary for the game that they're making. They don't do a lot of 3D art. They like blocking things out. They do a lot of lighting work and a lot of scripting work. So again, for the tools, what's the average level designer? It's this one. But of course, again, it does not exist. There is no average level designer. Even so, depending on the studio you work for, you might not even call the level designer. You might call it like an environment designer or something else, or just technical designers who do level design. There's no average here. So just as much as there's no sensible default, it's important to think that there are, of course, defaults. There is an initial setting for everything, but you can't think of them as sensible. If you start thinking them as sensible, you're going to start thinking, oh, we can just use this and it'll probably be fine. Averaging out is bad. Quick caveat when it comes to professional tools. If you make like a quick app or like a website for people to book like flight tickets on, of course, you need to make it very simple and easy, and defaults are important. But if you have a professional tool, making these things adjustable is very, very important. So there are no sensible defaults. There are instead editable defaults. Think of the defaults as editable. What can a user change about these defaults? So let's look at your digital space. Let's grab some examples. Unity. We have the overlays here on the 3D view. We can turn those on and off. We can also turn them all on and off. That's pretty neat. We have this toolbar here that we can drag around and snap to other positions, so it's very easy to just set something in a different place. We can also move these toolbars around. That's very neat. We can also move these windows around. A lot of editors nowadays can do that. It's nice. It's a good basic thing. You can also save the layout and then load the layout. You can send the layout to someone else so they can use your layout. That's pretty neat. If you go to the menu here to the shortcuts, you get a literal visual overview of all your shortcuts. Isn't that super cool and neat? Like you can see what buttons are being used and what are not being used, and you can change all of these buttons, like what is being used for what. Super powerful stuff. Like we do this in the games that we make, but not often in the tools that we make. I mean, isn't that weird? Anyway, we can't right-click on these toolbars and just start dragging things around. Like, for example, if I use this function a lot, I can't just drag it onto the toolbar if I use a lot. I still have to go through this menu and like click it there. So there's a little bit of some trouble still there. Unreal, very similar stuff. We have this overlay over here. We can turn, for example, this FPS counter on, and then that appears over there so we can change some things. Again, we can't drag these things off and use them somewhere else as quickly. At least I haven't found a way of doing it. In the overlay, we can turn it off, but then the FPS counter still remains, and we can't turn that off anymore because we removed the menu. So, turn it on back on again, and now I can remove that FPS counter. So yeah, I can edit some of these things. One really cool thing that I have is you can drag out this window, and it'll actually snap it to specific sections. So instead of having it float or having difficulty setting it up, I can snap it to a particular section so I can quickly set up my UI in the way that I want. What's something else? Well, they have this new modal system where we can switch between all these different modes. Well, not sort of new, but they changed it a little bit in UE5. Again, I can't just like drag this out and put it somewhere else so I can quickly move between these. I have to do this like really per the modal thing. All right. And then we also have, of course, the shortcuts, in which case we can go to preferences here, to the shortcuts, and it's just a giant list. There's no visual overview of this. It's just, here's a giant list. You can go through it. So you can change everything. That's good. But it's hard to figure out like which buttons are being used, which ones are not being used. You'll have a little bit more trouble there. Now, of course, there was a talk like 30 minutes ago. Yes, you can, of course, edit the UI. I'm not saying you can't. Same with Unity. There's loads of people who edit their UI. I'm saying how easy is it to edit that UI and to edit in Unreal? Like how easily can you do these things? Yeah, I snapped this picture like an hour ago, so put it in. So let's take a look at something that's a very easy way of doing this kind of editor UI. For example, Keynote. Right-click on the toolbar, customize toolbar. There you go. There's all your functions. You can now drag them into the toolbar and just have them there. You can also drag them off and they will disappear a little poof. That's neat. But yeah, I can just like set things up very easily. I don't have to know about scripting. I don't have to know about anything else. I just right-click and say, I want to edit this thing. Let me edit this thing, and it allows you to do it. And of course, there's a default. I can drag that default onto it and reset it, and then I can just drag things on again. It's super neat. Also, I want to be clear, I worked at Apple, but I did not work on this. I don't want to take credit for this. Also, I can twist it icons or text, and icons only. Like if I'm a superpower user, I might not want to see the text anymore, just the icons. I know what I'm doing. Again, allowing the user to set up the workflow in the way they want. And of course, Blender. We have a lot of different modes when we start out, like a lot of different sections, a lot of different UIs that we can choose and pick from. It's pretty neat. We can also, create more and do some editing over there, or duplicate the current one and do things with it. That's pretty neat. Again, we can't like just drag these things out and place them someplace else if I want to quickly use them, if I don't want to go through these drop-downs. But we do have the quick favorites menu, which I love. For example, I can go with this menu here and then right-click, add to quick menu. Right-click, add to quick menu. Even this transform gizmo. Cool, add to quick menu. And now when I use a quick menu, bam, there it is. I can place a cube, I can place a torus, I can change to the move gizmo. Super fast. I can just set these things up. There's no previous knowledge necessary to do it. You can just start doing it. But with the shortcuts, there's this thing that I have with Blender and the industry compatible hotkeys, which when you initially start a Blender, they ask you what kind of hotkeys you want. And now if I press Q, which is the quick favorites menu, I set switch between selection modes, because if I go to the documentation, it will just say quick favorites, press Q. But what if I started a Blender with industry compatible? I don't know what to do. I looked around a lot for like, what do I need to do? What am I doing wrong? Googling around, like Q isn't doing anything. Like, oh no, you're in industry compatible. Like, oh, right. So it'd be nice if, in here it also says if you're using a different one, it's these hotkeys. You see this in some of the documentation of Unreal and Unity, I think, where they switch between like, are you using scripting or blueprints? These are two different ways of doing it. That's a cool way of doing it. Maya, the shelf. It's a really, really cool way of doing it. They have all these shelves initially when you start out. So you have all these different functions that you can use. You can switch between them. But as you can see, it's again very modal of like, you're either doing this, or you're doing this, or you're doing this. But we can create our own shelf. Let's create my shelf. And now we can go through the menus here, and I just click to add functionality. To be fair, it's Control-Shift-Click or something like that. Like it's not easy to find out if you don't know about this, but again, you can just like set anything on there, and then I can go between all these different menus, and it doesn't matter what kind of thing that I'm using, I can just start adding that to a shelf, and I can create multiple shelves depending on the workflow that I'm doing. I think one of the funniest ones I think is that you can literally add almost anything out of these menus into the toolbar, like even the About section of Arnold. So I can kind of click on like that and get the About of Arnold. So literally anything. Now the thing that I call it the Maya shelf for this is because in AAA, if you work in AAA, I'm betting you have one. It was probably set up by a tech artist 15 years ago. It's shared with everyone else in the company. Now every single artist uses it, and when someone new joins, everyone is recommended to use it. It's critical for the pipeline. Like if that thing breaks, the whole thing shuts down. There's some Mel scripts in there that are super necessary. And you know what? The tech artists that made that, the play doesn't work there anymore. They're long gone. But if you work in AAA, you probably have one of these. So you can see how important it is to have your toolbar and your tools be editable in these ways. Now, of course, toolbars aren't everything. They're just a nice example, and I have 20 minutes here, so I got to show one particular thing. But this is really about everything. And it's about adjusting to your needs. Like, you're going to be working this tool for 8+ hours a day for 4 years on a big project. Like, you need to be comfortable in these tools. So it's questions asking like, what is on the toolbar? What is in the drop-downs? Which panels are visible? Do I have workspaces? Are my workflows clear? And is what I need where I need it? You can use a default, sure, but what does every single individual user need? And also an important point here is to not think per tool here, think per workflow. For example, for that level designer, what do we need to block out a combat area? Let's bring it back again. Workflow needs are probably something like a lot of geometry, not a lot of materials, not a lot of narrative, a lot of combat tools, yes, not a lot of 3D art, some lighting, and a lot of scripting. Sure, you're initially creating it, but what if I want to polish this combat area? You're going to go through a lot of work. Now, this whole thing changes. Now, it's a lot more materials, a lot more 3D art, a lot more lighting. Now, a design director or art director comes in and goes, no, we're going to have an NPC after this. Things change all the time. You never know. So what happens now? Now we need a lot of narrative tools. Like, a lot of these things change depending on the thing that you're doing. So it's important to not think per tool, think per workflow. So if you have a geometry tool, a shader graph, a scripting tool, a terrain tool, a lighting tools, and a dialogue tool, yes, they're all separate and usually created separately, but when a user is using them, they blend together between them. Here's the combat workflow, you use these tools. Here's the narrative workflow, you're using these tools. Here's the cinematics workflow, you're using these tools. Here's the grayboxing workflow, you're using these tools. You can't think of these tools as individual things that people will use to get from A to Z to a finished product. They're going to use them throughout each other. So, what are the solutions to these things? What can we do to make things better? Make the defaults adjustable, allowing users to set up their own workflow, allowing users to be creative, allowing them the creativity of setting up the workflow that they are comfortable working, looking at what other tools allow them to adjust, because they're going to be switching between tools, and not forcing your users into uncomfortable workflows where they're going to be annoyed about it. Like, it's going to make them really unhappy, and also their work is going to suffer from it. And don't think of defaults as sensible. Yes, you're going to have defaults. Don't think of them as sensible, because you fall into a trap of like, oh, we'll just do this and it'll be fine. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, if I can access everything I need all the time, like I've set up this workflow with all these buttons, doesn't that mean I have a really busy and complex view? Yes, for example, this Blender view has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different toolbars and like a lot of different windows. Yes, that's complicated. If you first start this up, it's going to be hard to look at. Unreal did a thing recently where in UE4, you had a lot of stuff going on in the UI. UE5, they cut that down. A lot of that is gone now, and it's a little bit easier to look at when you start up. And it's good and nice for new people who are starting up the editor, but I don't think this is entirely the right direction to go for. And to talk about that, we need to be talking about airplanes again. All right, so for example, you look at a cockpit of like, there's a whole loads of buttons. You're going to sit down, you're going to be like, how do I fly this plane? What do I do? Yes, absolutely. If you're going to like just sit down, you're not going to be able to fly that plane. If it's already flying, you're probably going to crash it. Absolutely. That's a very difficult thing to work with. However, if you're an actual pilot, you have gone through hours, like hundreds of hours of training before you ever sat down with real people behind you. So is the cockpit view bad? No, not necessarily. If you know exactly what you're doing, it's actually a very good way of working. Because all these buttons have their own particular uses. They're necessary for particular things. They might be edge cases, might not happen often, but they're very, very necessary. And also it's important to know, like, if you're, for example, a pilot and you're switching between an Airbus plane and a Boeing plane, you can't just do that. Like, you need to spend a lot more time training to make sure that you can make that switch. Which is really weird because, like, in the editors and tools that we use in our lifetime, for example, Unity, Maya, Blender, Jira, Confluence, ShotGrid, and yes, these are also tools, not just 3D tools. All tools matter in these workflows. We're expected to just switch between them all the time. Like, that is going to be difficult. That is going to make people confused and not want to use these tools because it's so difficult to switch between them. So what I'm saying here is not like cockpits are bad, because like cockpits aren't necessarily bad if your users know what they're doing. If that cockpit is adjustable, if they can fit it to their exact needs, if they can find everything, if they can make their own workflow, if the visualization is for them, and if they can work well, it's really not that bad to have that cockpit view. If you're looking over someone's shoulder and you're like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. If they know exactly where to find everything, leave that alone. They're probably doing a great job. Of course, you can take a look and see if there's anything that they're missing, but it's still important to look at that and know what they're doing. So there's no such thing as a sensible default. Just don't think about sensible defaults. Think about editable defaults. At this point, a bunch of you are probably thinking, that's great, but this will cost time and money. Like, it's great if we want to do that, but how are we going to find the time and money? Well, instead I would say, how much time and money are you losing on this? So this is a slide from Jim Brown from GDC 2010. It's 12 years ago, but it's still very relevant. If you're having, for example, saving through some editor tool, like 2.4 minutes a day, over 100 employees, 200 minutes a day is like 4 hours a day, then 4 hours a day is 20 hours a week. 20 hours a week with 6 man projects on your time, then it's 1 year of your time on the project. Like, a lot of these small things that save people a lot of time can really help cut down on the cost of your production by making it faster and easier to do these things. So yes, it takes a little bit of effort to make things editable, but if you don't do them, you're going to lose a lot of time and effort as well. Of course, another argument is like, well, you can't argue it's a P1. P1 is often argued as like, well, I mean, it's not critical for workflow. You can do the work. It's possible to do the work. And yes, for all the tools that I showed, you can do everything. It's totally possible. But if that's the case, if you're saying, oh, this editing isn't necessary because it's not, critical for workflow, then you are measuring priority in the wrong way. Because if all the thing that you're looking at is this functional, if that is the one thing that you're measuring priority with, then you're going to make a lot of stuff that is definitely functional, but super annoying and awful to use. And people will really, really dislike that. They won't get into a creative mood because of it. They won't get into the flow of work. So if you're just thinking like, well, no, it's not a P1, you're measuring it wrong. Like, measure also with like, we need a functionality, and also how much time are we saving with this? Is this nice for the people that we're working with? Those need to be part of your prioritization. And of course, there's a lot of other issues of suboptimal tooling. Like, if your tooling isn't great for your users, there are things like longer training times. Like, someone comes into your company and they're just like, hey, I need to start working. And you're like, okay, yeah, so you got to click this thing, then click this thing. Then there's going to be a warning. Ignore that, and then click this thing, and then click this thing. We've all done it, let's be honest. That really doesn't help when teaching new people. And also, there's more mental overhead. You're just like busy thinking about, like, okay, which warning do I need to ignore and which one not? Which error is bad and which one is not? Where do I need to find this thing? Like, you can't be as creative. And also, you just have unhappy people and churn. Like, people are going like, oh, I don't want to work at this company anymore. They use this tool, and I'm just like sick of doing that. I'm going to work someplace else that makes me happier and trying to do more of my thing. Like, people will be unhappy with bad tools. So yeah, you can't argue it's P1, but are you willing to lose people in your company over it? Isn't that a high priority too? Now, of course, that's a whole other talk. I can talk for ages about it, but we're almost at the end over here. So, there's no such thing as a sensible default. What does that mean? So, defaults aren't bad, but we need to think of them, but don't think of them as sensible. And treat defaults as temporary. Don't rely on those defaults. And you have to give the user the power to easily edit those defaults. And I'm saying easily here, because as we've seen with Unity and Unreal, there's definitely things possible, but as we see also with Blender and Keynote, there's easier ways of doing those things. And look at what other editors can adjust. Can you do similar things? And think about your prioritization metrics. Are we prioritizing tools in the correct way? And again, think back to the human being. Because in the end, we're all human beings using these tools. It's important for all of us to have a good workflow, but also a happy workflow. Thank you very much. I'd like to give a quick thanks to these folks for giving me feedback on this. I really appreciate it. Also, there's a tool design roundtable for the very first time over here. It's literally in 1 hour in the Roundtable 0 room. So if you thought this was interesting and you want to talk more about tool UX, come on down. It's at the bottom floor right below us over here. These are the sources that I used. And thank you. I don't think we have time for questions. Do we have time for questions? No. But I heard that a lot of you love using LinkedIn QR codes, so I put the one over there. That's the thing that happened a lot here, which is neat. And also you can find my consulting info over there if you'd also like to hire me to look at your tools and help you advise on what your workflows could be. All right, thank you very much.